The courtroom door opened before the bailiff could stop it, and a man in army service blues walked straight up the center aisle holding a folder like it weighed more than it should. "Colonel, we found who really signed these." I didn't turn around right away. 6 years of military legal work had taught me that the worst thing you can do in a hearing room is react before you understand what's actually happening, and at that moment, sitting at the defense table with my hands folded so tightly my knuckles had gone pale, I still didn't fully understand what Major Owen Frist was holding, only that it had made him break protocol to bring it in mid-recess, and that whatever it was, it had arrived exactly 48 hours after my brother-in-law stood in this same room and told a military judge, without blinking, that I had forged my late husband's deployment papers myself. I'm Captain René Castillo, U.S. Army, and by that point I'd spent 9 years learning how to keep my composure in rooms designed to test it, supply convoys under pressure, legal proceedings, a memorial service I'd had to stand through without letting my knees buckle. Please subscribe my Brave Lady channel and also write in comment from where are you watching, thank you. None of that had prepared me for watching my late husband's own brother look a colonel in the eye and call me a criminal, over documents that had, in fact, been signed exactly the way they were supposed to be signed, by exactly the person who was supposed to sign them. I want to walk you through how we got to that folder in Major Frist's hand, because none of it happened the way Marcus Castillo told the court it did. My husband, Staff Sergeant Daniel Castillo, died 14 months ago during a training accident overseas, 3 weeks into what was supposed to be a routine 6-month rotation. I won't dwell on that part longer than I have to, except to say that grief, when it's sudden and far away and delivered by 2 officers standing at your front door in dress uniforms, doesn't leave much room to also brace yourself for what comes after. What came after, for me, was raising our 2 kids alone, keeping my own career moving forward at Fort Meridian as a logistics captain, and assuming, wrongly, that the hardest part was already behind me. Daniel had been thorough, almost stubbornly so, about paperwork before that deployment, the kind of careful you get from someone who's watched other soldiers leave things unsettled and seen what it costs their families. He'd updated his will, his power of attorney, and his service members' group life insurance beneficiary designation 2 weeks before he left, all of it processed through the legal assistance office on base and witnessed by a legal clerk named Staff Sergeant Diane Ruiz, a soft-spoken woman with a habit of double-checking every signature line twice before she'd notarize anything. Daniel had also signed a limited power of attorney naming me sole decision-maker for our children's guardianship in the event anything happened to him, standard practice, the kind of document most deploying parents sign and then never think about again. I remember the last normal conversation we had about any of it, the night before he left, sitting on the edge of our bed while I packed his duffel. "If anything ever happens," he said, only half joking the way people do when they're trying to make an unbearable topic feel lighter, "you make every call. Don't let my brother turn it into a committee meeting." I laughed at the time. I didn't understand yet how literally that sentence would matter. 14 months later, 3 weeks before the hearing that would put Major Frist in that aisle with a folder, I got a certified letter from an attorney I'd never heard of, informing me that Marcus Castillo, Daniel's older brother, was formally petitioning for guardianship review of our children and requesting a forensic audit of certain estate and beneficiary documents executed prior to Staff Sergeant Castillo's deployment, on the grounds that he had reason to believe those documents may not reflect his brother's genuine intent. That was the version of events everyone in that courtroom, 3 weeks later, would hear Marcus tell first. It would take 48 hours after his testimony for anyone to hear mine. Marcus Castillo had never been what I'd call close to Daniel, not in the way that matters day to day. The 2 brothers had grown up 4 years apart and drifted further with distance and time, Daniel enlisting at 19, Marcus staying close to their parents' hometown, working a string of jobs that never quite settled into a career, married to Denise for going on a decade. I'd met him maybe a dozen times over the years, mostly at holidays, and my clearest memory of him before any of this was a barbecue 2 summers back where he'd spent 20 minutes explaining an investment opportunity he wanted Daniel to put money into, an explanation Daniel had listened to politely and never mentioned again. He'd shown up at the funeral in a suit that fit too well for a man who claimed, more than once that week, that he was struggling financially, and he'd hugged me at the graveside and said all the right things about family sticking together. I remember thinking, at the time, that grief brings out strange versions of people, and I gave him the benefit of the doubt I'd have wanted extended to me. That benefit of the doubt didn't survive the first hearing. Marcus took the stand in a courtroom on base, a joint proceeding, part guardianship review, part fraud allegation, presided over by a military judge, Colonel Harriet Voss, a woman known around the legal community for a reputation of moving slowly and missing nothing. She sat with her reading glasses pushed low on her nose and a habit of setting her pen down flat and square before she asked a follow-up question, a small gesture that somehow made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Marcus wore the same well-fitted suit from the funeral. He had a habit, I noticed for the first time that day, of touching his wedding ring whenever he was about to say something he wasn't fully sure of, turning it once around his finger like it steadied him. "Your Honor," he said, "I believe my sister-in-law forged these deployment papers herself. The power of attorney, the guardianship designation, I don't believe my brother signed these documents in the state my sister-in-law claims he did. I think she took advantage of a small window before he left to secure control over decisions that should belong to our whole family." I sat perfectly still through that sentence, because I'd learned, over 6 years of watching legal proceedings from the inside, that the worst thing I could do was let my face answer before my attorney did. Major Owen Frist, seated beside me, didn't flinch either, though I felt his pen stop moving against his legal pad for exactly 1 beat before it started again. Frist had a habit that had become oddly comforting to me over the 3 weeks we'd worked together. Before saying anything difficult out loud, he tapped his pen twice against the table, like he was giving the thought a moment to settle before he handed it to you. He tapped it now, and leaned toward me just enough to murmur, "Don't react. Let him finish digging." Marcus kept going. "My mother has told me she has concerns as well," he said, and I watched Colonel Voss's expression shift very slightly, the particular sharpening a career judge gets when a witness starts citing someone who isn't in the room to confirm it. "And my wife, Denise, can speak to conversations she had with my brother before he left, where he expressed doubts about some of these arrangements." That was the first crack I felt open beneath the version of events I thought I understood, not doubt about the documents themselves, which I knew were real, but doubt about how far this had already spread beyond just Marcus. If Denise was prepared to testify, and his mother had concerns, this wasn't a single grieving brother acting alone. This was a story that had already been rehearsed by more than one person before it ever reached a courtroom. I met with Major Frist the next morning in his office, a small room with a single window that looked out over the motor pool, a coffee maker that had clearly seen better decades, and a corkboard behind his desk pinned with case notes in a shorthand only he seemed able to read. He set 2 cups of coffee down, slid one toward me, and got straight to it. "Here's what we know for certain," he said. "Diane Ruiz witnessed and notarized every document Daniel signed before he left. I've already pulled her notarization log. Every signature line, every date, matches what's in the legal assistance office's own records. On paper, procedurally, this should be an easy case to defend. Then why does it feel like it isn't?" I asked. "Because Marcus isn't actually attacking the documents," Frist said. "Not really. He's attacking your credibility in front of a judge who doesn't know you, using people who sound like they have no reason to lie, a grieving mother, a concerned sister-in-law. Judges don't rule on paperwork alone in cases like this. They rule on which version of events feels more trustworthy. Right now, he's telling a simpler story than we are, and simple stories win rooms faster than complicated true ones. So what do? We find out why he's really doing this," Frist said. "Men don't usually risk perjury over sentiment. There's almost always something underneath: money, property, control of something specific. I want you to think hard about what Marcus actually gains if this guardianship review succeeds and those documents get thrown out." I sat with that question longer than I wanted to. And then it hit me, cold and obvious in the way answers sometimes are once you stop being too close to see them. "The SGLI payout," I said. "If Daniel's beneficiary designation gets invalidated as fraudulent, it doesn't just disappear. It reverts to a prior designation, or gets distributed according to a different formula. Before Daniel and I updated everything 2 years ago, his listed beneficiary was his parents," Frist finished, watching me arrive at it. "Which means his mother, and by extension, likely Marcus, given his mother's age and health. That was the first real crack of daylight, and it also happened to be the first micro-cliffhanger of the whole ordeal, the quiet, sick realization that this had never actually been about my parenting or my trustworthiness at all. It had been about money the entire time, dressed up as concern. I spent the following days doing the one thing that still felt entirely within my control, my job. Fort Meridian's supply readiness cycle didn't pause for my personal life, and there was something steadying about spending a Tuesday morning walking a warehouse floor with my platoon sergeant, checking serial numbers against a manifest, solving a problem that had a clean, correct answer at the end of it. My platoon sergeant, a wiry, no-nonsense man named Delacroix who'd been in supply longer than I'd been alive, noticed I was somewhere else that morning and didn't push, just handed me the clipboard and said, "Numbers don't lie, Captain, whatever else is going on." I laughed for the first time in days. I remember standing in that warehouse afterward, clipboard in hand, thinking that I missed this feeling, the feeling of a problem that resolves itself through careful, verifiable work, instead of a problem that resolves itself through who a judge decides to believe. That grounding didn't last long. 2 days later, Frist called me with the second reveal, and this one came with an edge to his voice I hadn't heard from him before. "I need you to sit down for this," he said. I pulled the notarization ledger from the legal assistant's office again, cross-referencing every document processed the same week as Daniel's paperwork. "There's an additional document in that batch I don't think you've seen, a codicil to Daniel's will, dated 4 days after he actually deployed." "That's not possible," I said. "He was already gone. He couldn't have signed anything 4 days after he left." "That's exactly the problem," Frist said. "Someone signed something using his name, 4 days after he was already overseas, and it was notarized by Diane Ruiz." I felt the floor of the entire case shift under me. Diane wouldn't forge a document. "I don't think she did, knowingly," Frist said. "I think someone handed her something and told her a story that made it look routine. I want to talk to her directly, off the record, before this becomes something she has to answer for under oath without warning." We met Diane Ruiz in a small conference room 2 days later, and I understood within the first minute why Frist had wanted to speak with her gently. She was younger than I'd expected, with a nervous habit of straightening papers into perfectly squared stacks even when they were already straight, and when Frist laid out the dated discrepancy in front of her, her hands stopped moving entirely. "I remember that one," she said quietly. "Marcus brought it in. He told me Daniel had signed it before he left but forgot to have it notarized in time, and that he was just helping get the paperwork properly finalized before it went into the file. I didn't see anything wrong with that. People forget to notarize things under deadline pressure all the time." She looked up at me, and I watched something like dawning horror cross her face. "He told me it was already signed. I never watched Daniel sign it. I just notarized what was already on the page." "Did Marcus tell you what the codicil said?" Frist asked. "Something about reassigning a portion of the estate," Diane said. "I didn't read it closely. It wasn't my place to. He seemed like family checking in on family. I had no reason to think otherwise." Her voice dropped lower. "I've notarized probably 400 documents in this office. I've never once had someone lie to my face about who signed something. I don't know how to feel useful again after finding out I might have helped him do that without knowing it." "You didn't do anything wrong," I told her, and meant it, even through everything I was feeling in that moment. "He used the fact that you're careful and trusting against you. That's not the same as you being careless." She didn't look fully convinced, but she nodded, and it was clear something in her had shifted from confusion into resolve. That was the third reveal, and it was the sharpest one yet. Marcus hadn't just been questioning my honesty in court. He had, 14 months earlier, actually forged a codicil in his dead brother's name and gotten it notarized using a legal clerk who trusted him because he shared Daniel's last name and Daniel's face. The fourth reveal arrived from a direction I hadn't expected, a phone call from Denise Castillo, Marcus's wife, 3 days before the second hearing. I almost didn't answer. When I did, her voice was tight, careful, like she was choosing each word for the first time rather than reciting something rehearsed. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to let me get through it before you say anything." I stayed quiet. Marcus told me Daniel had expressed doubts about the guardianship arrangement, she said. He told me that months ago, before any of this started, and I believed him, because why would he lie about something like that? I repeated it to people. I was prepared to say it under oath if it came to that. Her voice cracked slightly. I found the codicil in his desk last week. I wasn't looking for it, I was looking for tax paperwork. But once I saw the date on it, and realized Daniel was already gone by then, I understood he'd been lying to me the entire time, not just building a case, actually forging something and hoping I'd never ask enough questions to notice. Why are you telling me this now? I asked. Because I already told one lie for him in that courtroom, by staying quiet about doubts I should have raised, Denise said. I'm not doing that twice. I don't know what happens to my marriage after this. I know what I'm supposed to do with what I found. That was the fourth injustice folding into something else entirely, not just an accusation, but a slow unraveling of everyone Marcus had convinced to help him build it, one of whom was now choosing, at real personal cost, to stop. The fifth and final piece arrived the day before the second hearing, when Frist's request for a forensic document examination came back from the CID lab. The signature on the codicil, compared against verified samples of Daniel's actual handwriting from military records, showed inconsistencies in pen pressure and letter formation inconsistent with a genuine signature, the kind of finding that doesn't prove intent on its own, but combined with a dated impossibility and Diane's testimony about who had physically delivered the document, it didn't need to prove intent alone anymore. We walked into that second hearing with all four pieces: the dated impossibility, Diane's account, Denise's discovery, and the forensic finding, and I still didn't know, sitting at that defense table, whether it would be enough to unravel a story Marcus had already told to a judge with total, practiced confidence. Marcus was still on the stand when Colonel Voss called the recess, midway through a second round of testimony where he'd begun, with visible confidence, to suggest that I might have coached Diane Ruiz into her earlier statement. He'd leaned into that theory for a full 10 minutes, gesturing at me once as though I were the one under scrutiny instead of him, and I remember Frist's hand resting flat against the table beside mine, a silent reminder not to react. Marcus didn't yet know what had happened in the 48 hours since his first testimony. He didn't know Denise had come forward. He didn't know the CID lab had finished its analysis. He found out the moment Major Frist walked back into that courtroom before the recess had even officially ended, a folder in his hand. The same folder I'd later learn contained 3 separate documents clipped together with color-coded tabs, and said the sentence that had brought us to this exact point: "Colonel, we found who really signed these." Colonel Voss allowed it, over the opposing attorney's objection, given the folder's direct bearing on testimony already entered into record. She set her reading glasses down flat on the bench, the same small precise gesture I'd noticed from her earlier, and gestured for Frist to approach. With the court's permission, he read the forensic examiner's findings into the record: the pen pressure inconsistencies, the letter formation mismatches, the plain, undeniable fact that the codicil bore a signature dated 4 days after Daniel Castillo had already deployed overseas, a date confirmed against his official movement records that placed him, that specific day, at a staging base 2 time zones away from the notary's office where the document had supposedly been signed in person. Marcus's expression, up to that point composed and rehearsed, shifted for the first time not to guilt exactly, but to the particular blankness of a man watching a story he'd built collapse faster than he could patch it. "That document was reviewed by our family attorney," he said, too quickly, his hand going to his wedding ring again, turning it twice this time instead of once. "I didn't create it myself." "Then perhaps you can explain," Colonel Voss said, her voice even, not raised at all, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted, "how Staff Sergeant Ruiz came to notarize a document you personally delivered to her, on a date when the person listed as its signer was, according to his own unit's deployment manifest, already overseas." Marcus didn't have an answer that survived contact with that question. He opened his mouth once, closed it, and looked, for the first time in either hearing, at me directly, like he was searching my face for some kind of permission to stop. Then came the twist none of us, including Frist, had fully anticipated. Diane Ruiz, called back to the stand to formally enter her account into the record, added something she hadn't mentioned in our earlier private conversation, that Marcus had approached her a second time, several months later, asking whether she could informally notarize another document related to the children's guardianship, and that when she'd hesitated that time, he'd mentioned, almost in passing, that his mother didn't need to know the details, just needed the paperwork to look right for her. Diane had refused that second request outright. She hadn't reported it at the time, she admitted, because she hadn't wanted to accuse a grieving family member of something she couldn't fully prove. But it meant Marcus's mother, the concerned family member he'd cited in his very first sentence to the court, had likely never seen the actual paperwork at all, and had been kept in the dark about what her son was really doing in her name. Marcus Castillo had not only forged one document. He had tried, and failed, to forge a second, and had been prepared to let his own mother's name lend credibility to both. The findings, when Colonel Voss issued them 2 weeks later, were about as clear as findings get. The original power of attorney, will, and beneficiary designation Daniel had signed before deploying were upheld in full as legitimate, with the court noting specifically that every procedural safeguard around their execution had been followed correctly the first time, 14 months earlier. The codicil was formally invalidated and referred, along with the broader pattern of conduct, for criminal prosecution. Forgery and attempted fraud carry real weight in a military legal system, and Marcus Castillo, a civilian with no uniform to shield him and no chain of command to soften the outcome, faced the full civilian consequences of both. His attorney, I heard later, tried to argue mitigating circumstances around grief and financial stress. Colonel Voss's written findings addressed that argument directly, noting that grief explains a great deal, but it does not explain a second attempt at forgery months after the first one had already succeeded. Denise Castillo was not charged with anything. She had knowingly repeated a false claim in the earlier hearing, but had corrected it voluntarily, at real cost to her own marriage, before being compelled to. Colonel Voss noted this distinction specifically in her findings, drawing a clear line between a man who had actively built a fraud and a woman who had believed him and then chosen, once she knew better, to stop protecting the lie. Denise reached out to me once more, weeks later, not asking for anything, just to say that she was sorry, and that she hoped someday the kids might know their aunt hadn't been part of building the lie, even if she'd carried it for a while before she understood what it was. She told me she and Marcus had separated, that she'd moved in temporarily with a friend 2 towns over, and that she was, for the first time in a long time, sleeping through the night. I told her that door wasn't closed. I meant it. Diane Ruiz kept her position in the legal assistance office, though she requested, and received, additional training on verifying document authenticity before notarizing anything brought to her outside standard procedure, a small, practical form of accountability she asked for herself before anyone required it of her. She sent me a short note afterward that said only, "I should have asked more questions. I'll ask them from now on." I appreciated that she didn't try to make it more complicated than it needed to be, and I made a point of stopping by her office a few months later, not for any paperwork, just to tell her that the kids were doing well, because I suspected she'd spent more nights than she let on wondering whether she'd played some part in hurting them. Major Owen Frist, for his part, never asked for recognition beyond doing his job well, but I made certain, in every account I gave of that case afterward, that his name came attached to the reason it turned out the way it did. The pen-tap pause before hard conversations, the instinct to ask what someone actually gains before assuming what they claim to feel. He told me once, near the end of the case, that the question that cracked it open, what does Marcus actually gain, was the same question he asked in nearly every case that looked, on the surface, like it was about something other than money. "It almost always comes back to money or control," he said. "People just prefer to dress it up as love." 1 year later, I stood in our backyard at Fort Meridian, watching my daughter chase her little brother around a swing set Daniel had put together the summer before he deployed, half finished honestly, one bolt still slightly loose no matter how many times I tightened it. Marcus's mother reached out to me that spring, quietly, asking if she could see the kids sometime, admitting she hadn't known the extent of what her son had done in her name, that she'd only learned the full truth from the court's own findings, the same way most of us had. I told her yes. Not because it erased anything, but because the kids deserved a grandmother who hadn't been part of building the lie, even if it had taken her a long time to learn she'd been standing near one. She came the following weekend, sat on our porch steps with a cup of coffee she barely touched, and watched her grandchildren for 2 hours without saying much at all. It was a start. I think about Marcus's sentence sometimes. She forged these deployment papers herself, and what it taught me about the particular kind of confidence a lie can wear when nobody's checked the paperwork yet. The truth, when it finally arrived, didn't need me to raise my voice. It just needed someone willing to look closely enough, and long enough, to find out who really signed what. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments what part hit hardest. And if you want more stories like this one, stay close, there's another one coming soon.